To stay up to date with everything here at QCA, please subscribe to our channel and feel free to share our efforts and support our cause. Jazakumullahu khairan for watching.
Awesome. Alrighty. Well, again, Jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you all so much for having me. I am going to be presenting a little bit of a kind of brief overview of Palestine. Let me give you all the roadmap of our talk today. So I'm hoping that we leave today's discussion with a more in-depth understanding of what the Palestinian struggle is about and what it is against. Obviously, especially as Muslims growing up, we are always told about Palestine, but I want to make sure that we understand what the different terms are that we use to discuss this issue and understand the historical context. And so we're going to go over things like what is Zionism, what is settler colonialism, which is not a word that you're going to use every day. So it's good to have an understanding of that. And then a brief history kind of the area of Palestine leading up till now, and then a discussion of modern day Palestine under apartheid. Okay, so this might be a little basic, but just to make sure that we all know how to find Palestine on a map, I've got a little screenshot for y'all there. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but it is right next to Jordan. You can kind of see it touching on Egypt. At the north is touching Syria, touching Lebanon. It's very centrally located, I would say, in the Middle East. And a lot of, I guess, Western media will call it like a strategic location within the Middle East. And then when you zoom in, you can see what's kind of left of what is Palestine, that striped area of the West Bank and Gaza. Okay, so in order to understand the Palestinian struggle, we need to understand two key things. And these are two frameworks. So when I say frameworks, it's not to be complicated. It's just the lens that we're going to view something with. So if you see something out of context and let's say, for example, the framework that we view Islamophobia in, we view it as kind of like a part of a larger system. Let's say, for example, when those 3 Muslim youth were murdered in, I believe it was on the East Coast, if you guys remember, and the media called it a parking dispute and said, oh, these are just 2 neighbors that were fighting, and these Muslim youth happened to be kind of the victims of that. That's because they're viewing this like violence as under a framework separate than the framework that we see, and we saw it as an Islamophobic action, and we know that it's connected to the greater rise of Islamophobia in the country. So that's kind of an explanation of like the way frameworks change how you see something. And so when we are talking about Palestine, the 2 key frameworks that we have to understand is that the struggle for Palestinian rights is a struggle against settler colonialism, and that the current manifestation of settler colonialism in Palestine is enforced and sustained through a system of apartheid. So we're going to go through both of these things so that we can fully understand them before this session is over. And then, of course, we'll do Q&A at the end, inshallah. So who would like to read the definition of settler colonialism? Anyone want to volunteer?
I can do it.
Okay, jump on in.
All right, so what is settler colonialism? Settler colonialism is the process by which a foreign people invade a territory under the oversight of an imperial power and establish settlements as a part of a larger colonial project that involves the necessary displacement of the indigenous peoples.
Jazakallah khair. Okay, so let's break that down. I'm sure y'all have, in the course of your history classes, talked about colonization and colonies, right? And when we think about it, at least I know for sure when I was growing up and learning about colonization, I learned about it as something that happened in the past. It's no longer happening. Colonies are over. Everyone's free. That is definitely a misconception that we grow up with. And the same way we understand that a foreign entity came, for example, into the US, or which was then known as just the Americas, and established colonies here that required the displacement of Native Americans in order to allow for the placement of Europeans. That's the same framework that we look at with what's going on in Palestine, which is the establishment of a foreign group of people by an oversight of an imperial power. Imperial meaning like an empire or power that has, I guess, a larger power. So here we would talk about Great Britain's role in kind of establishing the dominance of a foreign people by displacing the indigenous people. So when you guys learn about colonization, did you guys all kind of learn about, different colonies being set up so that the colonizer can use that land to like create resources for themselves? Like, for example, the colonies that were set up in India to create like a tea trade in Great Britain. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like the typical colonization framework. When we're talking about settler colonialism, it's that, but instead of just using the land, they also want the land for its resources. They also want to use the land for living and for creating a new settlement, basically. And so that's the big difference. Settler colonialism destroys to replace. And here you see a picture of what was formerly a village, I believe this was Safuria in Palestine, and how the destruction of that village during the Nakba, which we'll talk about later, you can see in modern day back behind that picture, it's literally just trees now. Like they completely destroyed, replaced, wiped them off the map. And that was the way that they took over that area. Sometimes they replace by physically inhabiting homes, but here they did it by just wiping off that city from the map. So like we said, there's a comparison here of settler colonialism. You can kind of see Palestine in 1946, the UN plan to split it up. We'll talk about that too. 1967, and where in 2010 it is, you can see how the Palestinian people are being pushed further and further together. And of course, this requires, in order to get from this image in 1946 to this image in 2010, you don't just push them kind of and push the people in together. You're also, it's necessary for you to murder the people who are here to create this smaller land and to displace them, to make them leave. And so you see a similar thing happening with respect to the United States in 1850 and how in 1775, 1850, and how it's slowly pushing until even modern day, there's even less and less land held in reserve by the Indian government. And you can kind of see these images juxtaposing of like the settlers taunting the indigenous people in both countries, both in the US and in Palestine. Okay, so that is what settler colonialism is in a nutshell. How many of y'all have heard the term Zionism? I'm hoping everybody, but if not, we're going to go through it. We're going to go through two definitions of Zionism. So we're going to talk about Zionism from the standpoint of people who support Zionism, what they define Zionism as, and then we're going to talk about Zionism in the standpoint of its victims. So Zionism emerged as a national movement in Eastern Europe from the 1880s for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Palestine. So that is basically in a nutshell what Zionism is from its supporters. We are just returning to our homeland and we are resuming Jewish sovereignty where we once were sovereign in the land of Palestine. Notice what is missing from this definition. We'll see in the next slide, or I guess in the next. So Zionism from the standpoint of its victims is a settler colonial movement whose goal is the establishment of a Jewish state on the ruins and ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people. So what is the difference between these two definitions? What stands out to us?
They kind of think differently.
That's definitely true. And then the biggest difference is that there's no mention of Palestinian people or there even being people at all in the definition of Zionism and the standpoint of its supporters. And that's a very necessary part of that definition, assuming that Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land. I don't know if y'all have heard that Zionist phrase, but it's completely divorced from the reality, which is the fact that Palestine had roads, had government, had people, had a culture, had a tradition. And so any definition of Zionism that removes the existence of Palestinian people is necessary to kind of like allow the way that Israel is functioning today, basically. So that's the biggest difference. So let's get into the history a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go through this quickly just so that we kind of have a backdrop of Zionism. There's a lot that you can read on this topic. You can even find the founder of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, has a pamphlet in which he discusses why Zionism is important. This is back in the 1800s, in which he discusses even potentially using the concept of Zionism, the concept of finding Jewish people a homeland, and saying that it could be anywhere. It doesn't necessarily need to be in Palestine. At one point, they were thinking about using Uganda as the potential homeland. But in the minds of Christian religious Protestants at the time, they had this belief, and a lot of them, even till this day, a lot of Christian Zionists have this belief that the return of Jesus Christ is conditional on the settlement of Jews in Palestine. And so with that, plus, the fact that, of course, there's a Holy Land, and there's no denying that every single religion has a beautiful claim, a beautiful tie to the Holy Land. But of course, that's not going to be in any way connected to the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So in their minds, they kind of started shifting towards the idea of the homeland. It will be in Palestine. There were different conferences, there were different statements, and even the birth of Zionism, you'll see that it had in itself a lot of anti-Semitism. A lot of the UK, the Great Britain Zionists at the time, they wanted to create an entity that would get rid of Jewish people from their land, which in itself was completely anti-Semitic. But you see that at the time, Palestinians were welcoming them in, up until even the Nakba itself. And so there's like a stark contrast between the people who purport to be supporting a people who went through oppression versus the people who are now currently going through oppression, and how they deal with welcoming others into their land. And so the British military had a lot to do with establishing the control of Zionists in Palestine. So what we see here is Zionism exactly as settler colonialism, where we are demolishing what exists in order to construct something new. And this is from the mouth of the founder of Zionism himself. Another quote from David Ben-Gurion, he was the first prime minister of Israel. He says, "We must expel the Arabs and take their places, and if we have to use force to guarantee our own right to settle in those places, then we have force at our disposal. During the assault, we must be ready to strike the decisive blow, that is, either destroy the towns or expel its inhabitants so our people can replace them." So when we talk about Zionism today, a lot of times people want to completely brush over the fact that its founders had no qualms, no kind of hesitation to say these types of things, to be very blunt about what their mission was. And these are the people who are essential in the creation of the state of Israel. So that's why I'm highlighting these. And the next point, before we move on from Zionism, it is super important, Ms. Minna, to note that anti-Zionism does not equal anti-Semitism. To be in support of Palestine, you have to be anti-racist, and that includes rejecting anti-Semitism. There's no room for any type of racism, Semitism, any type of hatred of one another, because we understand that any type of movement to free a people has to be in itself pure and in solidarity with other oppressed peoples. So what we're understanding here is Zionism is a political ideology. You could be any type of religion. You could be atheist, you could be Christian, Muslim, and you could still be a Zionist. And Zionism is a colonialist project. It requires a people from another land coming and ethnically cleansing, displacing, and destroying the current population in order to place a new population. So that's the summary on Zionism. So let's do a little bit of history. Let's see where we are at on time. also. Okay, yeah, we are doing good on time. Okay, so who has heard of the UN Partition Plan? Maybe just like a show of hands. Okay, so if you haven't heard of it, so the United Nations established this plan that when Zionist settlers were starting, before even the Nakba happened, there were clashes between Zionist settlers, and there was kind of an inkling of the idea that Palestine was going to be abruptly taken. Even though you can ask, like, for example, my teta, Allah yarhamha, on my dad's side, she was about 20 or so when the Nakba happened, and she told me that her neighbors were Jewish. They Palestinian Muslims and the Jews that were resettled into the area they were doing business together. They were getting married to each other. This is all pre like the political ideology enforcing itself on the area, and so this is before all of that, leading up to basically the big uprising and the big displacement. The UN passed a resolution 181 in 1947, calling for the partition of Palestine into two states. So that's kind of where the idea of the two-state solution even arose. At the time, Zionist settlers made up only a third of the population, and mandatory Palestine is just basically the original. That's the phrase that's used for the original Palestinian area. So they only owned 7% of the land, but yet the UN plan, which was heavily influenced by Zionist lobbying, both in Great Britain and elsewhere, allocated 55% of the territory to the Jewish state and 42% to the Arab state. Of course, as you can see, this allocation completely removes people from the orange area, removes Palestinians living in that area and pushes them out. And that in itself was enough for the Arab Higher Committee, kind of the main political leadership of the Palestinian National Movement, to reject the UN plans, saying, like, why would we give up half of our land or more than half of our country? We don't understand, everyone's living here peacefully. There's really no reason for this. Of course, that's not the plan that, Zionists had. And so then after that, just a few months later, we see the Nakba beginning, the catastrophe. It's been basically 73 years. So we'll say that the anniversary is often commemorated as May 15th, but it began way before that. So the Nakba, or the catastrophe, is the time in which more than 500 Palestinian towns and villages were destroyed. It's when Zionist gangs, at the time known as the Haganah and Stern, and other different Zionist militias, which were later adopted into the Israeli occupation forces, went through different towns and just wiped them out. My teta talked about how when they came to her town in Zera around Al-Lid, they basically took the clothes that were on their back, grabbed their babies, and had to go. It was estimated that around 800,000 to 1 million Palestinians were ethnically cleansed at that point. So in addition to the deaths that occurred, there were a lot of people who were just forcefully moved. And you can see this map on the left kind of showing where a lot of people ended up. So some people who were once living kind of coastal side ended up moving into the West Bank. Some of them, like my family, went from the coastal area all the way into Jordan. And that was a 3-day walk, my teta says. You find Palestinians who ended up in Lebanon and Syria. These are people who were chased out basically at gunpoint. And so some were displaced internally. Some had to move internally within Palestine, and then some had to go into other countries. And this was the result after the 1947 uprising and the Nakba, and the establishment of Israel then began. And so this was the result here on the right. You see that Gaza maintained its borders and the West Bank did as well. And Jerusalem, Al-Quds, was still within West Bank territory at the time. It was still the capital of Palestine. So what happened in between 1948 and 1967? Lots of refugee camps were created, most of which, it's crazy to imagine that people, so refugee camps are supposed to be temporary establishments. And there are people who are living in refugee camps till this day. They have their keys to their homes back in what is now considered Israel. And they were never given statehood. They were never given a place to live. Then there's the West Bank, which was administered by Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, which at the time was administered by Egypt. Many Palestinians tried to go back during this time between 1948 and 1967. But laws were put into place by this newly founded state of Israel, the Absentee Property Law, that law. So that law basically made it so that if you were away from your home for a certain period of time, it is no longer your home. So that was how they legally, they created their own laws to legally claim the right to the houses that people were forced out of. And then there's the Israel's law of return, which is the opposite of what Palestinians ask for, which is our own right of return. It's referred to as a return, but really it's a law that allows anybody of Jewish ethnicity or of Jewish religion to go to Israel and get citizenship. So while it's referred to as return, there were really their understanding of return is like from centuries ago, basically, their return into that area. And so there are people in Brooklyn, New York, born and raised, who can return to claim citizenship in Israel, while my family is not allowed to enter its old home in Israel proper. So in 1964, Palestinians formed a representative organization known as the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And this is kind of a group that was tasked with waging a liberation struggle to try to get back the area of land that was taken in 1948. The PLO and its kind of strategizing within Palestine and within the surrounding Arab states led to a war in 1967 between Israel and the Arab states. And so, like we said in the beginning, West Bank at that time is being controlled by Jordan, and Gaza is being controlled by Egypt. After this war in 1967, Israel takes control of both the West Bank and of Gaza. So what you see today, where Israel controls the borders and doesn't allow people in, that began in 1967. Okay, so an occupation is when a military of one country takes over the control of another people, basically, or another country. So that's what we say the Israeli occupation began. That's the occupation of West Bank and Gaza. So we say that the middle area in that map, this map right here, this middle area, it's been colonized by settler colonialists. These two on the right and the left, West Bank and Gaza, are being occupied. So that's the difference in terminology. So the occupation has different facets to it that we're going to discuss. But in order to maintain its dominance in the occupied territories, we are seeing conditions of apartheid, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So apartheid. Apartheid, as defined by Article 2 of the Geneva Convention, it's a crime, it's a war crime, and it includes creating similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination as is practiced in South Africa. And it requires inhumane acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination of one racial group of people over another racial group of people by systematically oppressing them. And so we're going to talk about the different ways that we see apartheid in Israel. So this is just to break down the definition. Inhumane acts to establish domination of one racial group over another racial group by systematically oppressing them. So how do we see apartheid in Palestine? We see so many different facets of apartheid, and we had to stop at number 9, but the list goes on. But we see the denial of many different rights. So the right to life. So there's murder essentially with impunity by the Israeli occupation forces of Palestinian people. The right to liberty by being subjected to cruel, degrading punishment within the prisons. The right to liberty of person, again, by arbitrary arrests and illegal imprisonment. So people in Palestine are subject to being taken and detained at any time and not really knowing like what their charges are or what they did. The right to freedom of movement, the right to freedom of residing where they want, even the right to freedom of marriage. If you want to marry someone from outside of the West Bank, that in itself is a whole process, and it's not something that you can freely do. To bring someone into Palestine, you have to leave in order to marry that person. It's not like the sorry, I was gonna say the law and the rule at the same time, so it came out as lul. The rules that people are living under are completely different than the laws and the rules of people of the settlers of Israel. And then the apartheid wall was placed. This is the wall that we know today, that it was used not only to separate Israel from Palestine, but also to take more land. So you can see on the right, the way that the wall is built, it's just like crunchy little edges everywhere. It's not like one smooth movement. And that was done strategically to take, literally to split farmers from their farmland, to take the fertile areas, the resources, and cut and carve them out in a way so that just to go and gather your crops, you have to get a permit to cross. And so the apartheid wall in itself, in addition to being oppressive just in itself, it also was a tool used to grab more land. So let's talk about the denial of the right to freedom of movement. There are checkpoints and roadblocks and settlements all throughout Palestine. When I went to Palestine for the first time, I visited family in Ramallah, which we go back here. You'll find Ramallah right here. And there's a checkpoint right here called Qalam checkpoint. To go through this checkpoint, you have to get out of your car, be pushed through what essentially is like looks like a chicken grate, and you're like pushing through to go through. It's in itself is a degrading process, and people are doing that every day to go from Ramallah to Al-Quds in order to go to work. And we'll see a quick video in a second. But in addition, in Ramallah, there are villages surrounding it that used to be connected directly by roads. Settlements have been created all throughout West Bank. So even though West Bank was technically supposed to be the Palestinian land, once it was being administered by Israel, they began to create settlements throughout. And once the settlements were created, Palestinians were no longer allowed to use the roads leading to the settlements. So what once was like, let's say a 5-minute drive down the highway, let's say it's US 75. Imagine you could just take US 75 from Campbell Road until Beltline. Imagine a settlement is put right in the middle and you're no longer allowed to take the highway. You're going to have to come around and take the big loop around to get to where you need to go. And so people who were once allowed kind of straight passage, as soon as settlements were created in their area, had to take like a 30-minute loop around in order to get to where they need to be, because the roads, even the roads in occupied Palestine have a religious identity. So these are the Jewish only roads, and these are the Palestinian roads, or the Arab roads as they refer. And then people need different permits, and we can see here how that's similar to an apartheid South Africa. There was a complex system, a pass or permit system used to control the movement of Black people. And we see something similar today with the control of the movement of Palestinian people. Let me see if this video will play. I just want to show the Qalam checkpoint. Let me know. What can y'all see right now so I can know if this is working?
No, it's not. It's just the image. Okay.
We can hear it, but nothing's moving.
Okay, let me see if resume. Oh, okay, that's pause share. New share. Okay, can y'all see it now?
Yes.
Okay, so we're gonna see what it looks like to go through the Qalam checkpoint. This is a 2-minute video. Let me see how we're doing on time. Okay, so no.
الساعة الآن 5 تماما. وصلنا منطقة حاجز كلنديا. شو فيه؟ شو فيه؟ ايه؟ دخلوا الضوء. سكروه. سكروه؟ كل يوم هيك بصير؟ كل يوم. ايه؟ كل يوم. وبعدين شو بصير؟ شو؟ برجع. ايه؟ برجع على الضوء. لا. هذا شو بدي نسوي؟ هذه المأساة يوم يعني أنا بطلع من بيتي الساعة 4 الصبح. قديش بعيد بيتي عن شغلي 4-5 دقائق بالسيارة. بلف على رمالة وبيجي على المعبر هذا عشان ألحق الطول. طيب دائما الجنود بدخلوش على السريع. هنا اليوم طلع وقفنا بالساحات برا. كما فوضى يوم بتكون فوضى على المعدل. احنا مشكلتنا مع المعبر.
SubhanAllah. So that video just shows the daily commute, quote unquote.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's...
Sorry, we had autoplay on. But that's the commute to go through a checkpoint. That checkpoint is what separates Ramallah from Al-Quds. And like one of the men in the video said, he lives in Ramallah. So imagine living in Richardson and working in Dallas, because obviously living outside of the city is cheaper, and there's also an issue within Palestine of even being allowed to live in Jerusalem, but the jobs might be better in the bigger city. So living in Ramallah, going to work in Jerusalem, which is literally a 5-minute drive, and they're being forced to leave for like a 7 a.m. job or 8 a.m. job by 4 a.m. to be at the checkpoint in order to just stand there and even just find out, are they going to be allowed to go to their job today? And it's purposefully chaotic. It's purposefully slow. It's the idea is to make it as miserable as possible, so these people who are just trying to live their daily lives will leave, basically. I don't know if we'll have the time for the next video, so I'm going to move forward. So in addition, so that was to discuss the denial of the right to freedom of movement, which is a big part of apartheid. We're also going to talk about the freedom of residence. There are so many legal and bureaucratic barriers to building homes for Palestinians in different areas. And we see right now the clashes that are happening in Sheikh Jarrah is just one more example of that, where these people were forced to leave in 1948. They were one of the few kind of groups that were able to return. And now the Israeli Supreme Court is saying, sorry, this isn't your home, you need to leave again. And so Israel creates these laws and legal barriers that keep people from being able to establish their homes. And they call that, their justice system, but really it's a system created by settler colonialists to maintain settler colonialism. And so you'll find a lot of Arab and Bedouin villages are not even recognized, and so they're considered illegal settlements, even though those are people living in their homes. There isn't really an ability for Palestinians to even like zone or create their own infrastructure. They're completely surrounded and controlled by Israeli military forces. You see homes being demolished. Home demolitions are used both as a punishment and as a way for making room for more Israeli settlements. For example, if one person is accused of a crime, and we can't even imagine that in the US context, but let's say you were accused, God forbid you were accused of some kind of crime, whether it was stealing or whatever. Instead of just putting you in jail, they also go to your family's house and destroy it. So now your family's homeless and, you've been convicted. And of course, you're being convicted in a court that the judge, the jury, and, the police and every step of the way is a settler. You're not being judged by your peers the way you would be in other places. And so home demolitions are used as collective punishment, and they're also used to clear way for new settlements. And so in the West Bank, a bunch of structures are being destroyed regularly. And we'll talk about in the BDS section that American companies are building the bulldozers that are used to destroy these homes. So this has resulted, the project, the Zionist project has resulted in the creation of countless refugees. Palestinian refugees are also often known as stateless refugees because they're, while some of us, like my family was lucky enough to become citizens of Jordan, but some remain stateless and either are living in refugee camps in Palestine or just have yet to be accepted into a new country. And so you'll see here in this little chart, there's like 12 refugee camps in Lebanon, there's 10 in Jordan, 9 in Syria, 19 in the West Bank. So in Palestine itself, there's refugee camps, and 8 in the Gaza Strip. And these are people who have no homes and are just living, waiting for the day that they're, given their right to return. So what can we do here? One of the biggest things that we can do and that people are called to do from within Palestine itself is to boycott, divest, and sanction, is to hit the military occupation in its pocket, basically. And so when we call for BDS, we're doing it with 3 goals in mind. One is to end the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, dismantle the wall. 2 is to give Arab Palestinian citizens their full rights and equality. So that means no more of the permit system, no more of Jewish and Palestinian split roads, no more of the inability to create houses, no more of any of these denial of rights. And then finally, number 3, giving the right to return to Palestinians as stipulated in UN Resolution 194. And so to allow, my family to go back to Nzir'a and rebuild, the homes that we were pushed out of. And so it's better to do kind of like a targeted boycott and focusing on a few companies. And so a lot of the focus has been on companies that are directly, not indirectly profiting, but directly, like the ones that they literally have bases in the settlements. For example, or they're doing things like creating, like HP Computers creates the technology that they use at checkpoints to vet whether or not Palestinians can even be allowed to enter. So that's a company that is boycotted. Caterpillar, which obviously in our day-to-day lives, we're not ordering Caterpillar bulldozers, but we do want to ask that our business leaders in our community are not using Caterpillar to build their new buildings, because those are the same company that's creating or allowing their products to be used and bought by the Israeli military to destroy houses in Palestine. And so there's a lot more in terms of that, the different organizations that we can be boycotting, but BDS by itself could take a whole another hour. So we'll suffice it to say that there's a lot to be learned on that topic. And otherwise, I think we kind of have concluded. So I want to just do a quick recap. So understanding the Palestinian struggle means understanding, 1, we are struggling against settler colonialism, and 2, settler colonialism is being maintained in Palestine through apartheid. So we understand what settler colonialism is. We understand that Zionism is the settler colonialist ideology that requires the creation of a new group of people or new state on top of a pre-existing state. And the only way to achieve Zionism's goals is through through apartheid. And so that is our recap. What questions do we have?
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Okay, you have talked about the boycott when it comes to products. What about social media? Is there any boycott that those students can do to social media, like Facebook, those who are supporting Israeli attack against Gaza? Is there anything you can tell us about that?
So that's kind of like a two-way street, because on the one hand, we do know that there have been people who have had their posts like shadow banned or deleted because they're posting about Palestine and that goes against community guidelines. But on the other hand, people in Palestine, especially in Sheikh Jarrah right now, are saying that the way that we're amplifying their voices through our social media has been so impactful and so powerful. So that's kind of like, it's a difficult one, because boycotting social media means also removing yourself from another platform that you can use to share. And I think here that the good outweighs the harm, because they've seen a huge difference in how people are looking at the issue now and how it's in everyone's faces and in a way that Palestinians haven't seen before.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
Any other questions, students?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Not student, but would love to be one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Noor, mashallah, la quwwata illa billah. Great presentation, mashallah, very enlightening. And scholars, they always say, لِكُلٍ نَصِيبٌ مِّنْ اسْمٍ. Everybody gets a share of their names, like of his name or her name. And subhanallah, Noor, and so you are like shining and enlightening everybody about this great cause. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So jazakumullah khair for this. Now, I have a question and also a plea, if you will. But nowadays, unfortunately, so many people are so uneducated about Palestine, and the historical facts, if you will, are very much distorted, right? But if we look as educators right now, we have a serious problem in our own curriculum, the school curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
We have anti-Palestinian lesson plans, anti-Muslim plans. And these are based here in Texas, and I believe in all over the states. But if we talk about Texas, and sometimes, we had a recent incident when one of our Allen ISD, I believe, Allen ISD parent, he was going to pick up his daughter from school, and she was crying very bad. And when he asked her, "Why are you crying?" She said, "I had a quiz today." He said, "You didn't do well?" She said, "No, but the only answer that I had to the quiz was to just say, or to admit that I am a terrorist." This is the answer to the quiz. Why? Because many Palestinians have been looked upon or described are presented in the curriculum as terrorists. And those who do not support the resolution with the Israel conflict, those ones who support are called moderate Palestinians. Other than that, they are the terrorists, right? Mm-hmm. So subhanAllah, what is it that we can do? Because we have to stand up. I mean, they already talked to the publisher, and alhamdulillah, through CARE and DFW, publishing, they decided that they are going to change or have a new version of that lesson plan. But we're not talking about Allen ISD, we're talking about every single place here in the US. Our kids are being educated, and sometimes, we know, how passive sometimes we become. We know, it's not right, but what can we do? This is a very dangerous zone if we don't stand up. So what can we do, and what are the basic things that can help us, educate everybody? Maybe like you can go and have so many talks like that in the public zone itself, and also how can we educate everybody and change the curriculum? This is the most important thing, to change the curriculum.
Well, of course, it's very necessary because, like I said in the beginning, like we're taught a lot of things that are incorrect growing up. We're taught that, you know, colonization isn't a thing anymore. We're taught like racism was in the past and we're like post-racial now. And so it's not even just Palestine. It's every sphere in which oppressors need to hold their ground or they're using education as another tool. And so we need to come at it from all different angles. And one being ensuring that, you know, students and their families are directly confronting teachers and not letting anything slide. Like we can't just say, oh, you know, everything's like this. Like we have to confront and say, if you're going to teach like this, let me as a parent come and explain to you guys a different perspective. So that's like kind of on the individual level, but then we also need to be pushing for young Muslim professionals to enter into the sphere of school districts and curriculum and you know, state level education organizations, so that our voices are heard while these curriculums are being created. And then even a more direct action item today, actually, there's a bill that just got passed by the House, HB 3979. It's a terrible bill. They're trying to, so this bill, when it passes, would prohibit any schools from conducting race and gender diversity trainings for teachers, administrator, and state employees. It would prohibit students from getting any type of course credit for participating in civic engagement. And it's going to discourage teachers from discussing current events and social studies courses. So it's just another way that like this Texas legislator is just closing the door from allowing teachers to use their platform to build a brighter and more conscious generation. So even if you could take the time and call your Texas senator, you could go, I think, just Google Texas Senate representative and put in your address and be able to find who your senator is. And just flood their phones today and tell them, like, this is terrible. This shouldn't even be something that we are considering, and letting them know that that's, you know, just making your voice heard in that sphere, because they're coming at it from every single angle. They're coming at it from the legislative angle. They're coming at it from the individual teachers. So making our voices heard is one of our most important tasks. And then on top of that is not doing it on an individual level. Like we can't combat what's coming at us from like a system-wide level by saying, oh, I by myself, I'm going to call everyone and I'm going to whatever. We have to plug into different organizations that are already doing this work, and use the organizational platform to combat other systems of oppression. So if that's joining Mass Pace, if that's joining the Palestinian Youth Movement, American Muslims for Palestine, there's so many organizations that are organizing on this, and our voices are heard better when we are collectively speaking.
So Noor, if anybody wanted to join Mass Pace, or American Youth Palestinian Movement, what would the process be? Who would they approach? Where would they go?
So they would just need to fill out a quick interest form so that we have your contact information. Let me see if I can, maybe I can
send it. And what are your activities? If you can just talk a little bit about that, like what is it that you do and what's the age range of the members that usually become part of your organization?
So Mass Pace right now is focusing on Palestinian advocacy, but we are also, you know, in line with any type of advocacy movement, whatever our youth want us to be doing and whatever we see as like an issue, we're jumping on it. So we've conducted trainings on white supremacy, what is that, how to get involved in local elections. Like we just want people to be well-rounded and leave our organization, or not leave, but like use what they learned from our organization to lead their communities. And so we know Islamically that talab al-ilm is farida, like it is an obligation on us to acquire knowledge. And so something that we're focusing on specifically is to have monthly teach-ins. So at the end of every month, hosting we would love to do it in person, inshallah, one day, but for now, because of COVID, we're doing it all virtually. but hosting discussions in which we talk about different topics, and we're letting the youth learn about them and then teach it to one another, because the best way to learn is by teaching. And so, I'm facilitating different readings for people and different articles that they can use to create presentations. So I think a lot of what we're doing right now is education, and then helping organize right now the on the ground efforts for Palestine. And so we would love, anyone to join right now. We have kind of a wide range, but I would say that we're lacking a lot of high school and middle school youth that we would love to have in our efforts. Right now, we have a lot of college age and Ammo Khalto age that are joining the efforts. And so we would love to have high school. Like, we want it to be as broad as possible, because everyone has a role in our struggle, and no voice is too small or too young. Everyone has an important role to play within this. So I'll send you, inshallah, I'll send you by text a link to our sign-up sheet. And that way girls can sign up and we can get them, inshallah, on our mailing list so they can be in the know on what our next thing is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And like two things you said that really stand out: education is key, which is what you're doing right now. And, there should be a representation of every age. Every age should be aware of this, whether you're a middle schooler, high schooler, young adult. Everybody has something to contribute. There's one question that has come on our live stream here, so I'm going to read out that for you. How effective are consumer boycotts? A lot of data shows that they don't usually result in policy or political change.
Okay, so let me share y'all a little infographic just to kind of give you guys an image of what a consumer boycott looks like when it is effective. I would have to disagree with the base idea that they're not effective. I think, first of all, just seeing the amount of money that Israel has been pouring into creating legislation in the US that bans boycotts, that by itself shows us that it's reaching and it's effective. There's no way that a country would spend millions of dollars just to get Texas to create an anti-boycott law in New York and Florida and Georgia when they don't find it as an effective tool. That's just not the way that a state would work. So let me show you guys. So that's just one aspect of it, but let me show you guys something really important about boycotts that we need to understand. Let me share my screen real quickly. Okay, so we see two little charts here, two little dots. One showing kind of each individual consumer or maybe small groups of consumers boycotting a bunch of different companies. And then, so this is a non-targeted consumer boycott. This is just...
Noor, if I may just interrupt you for a second, for the benefit of our younger grades, if you can explain what the red dots and the white arrows represent on the chart.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. So here, these red dots on the chart are going to represent different companies that support Israel in some capacity, whether it's indirectly by, because their shareholders or their CEO says that they love to give money to Israel, or it's because they have some settlements in Israel or company headquarters in Israel. So these are what these red dots represent, any type of Israeli supporting company. These white lines are going to represent consumers. So we're pointing at the different companies that we're boycotting. So here you can see kind of when you're not targeting and you're just boycotting any and every company, it's not going to be as effective. We're kind of all over the place. What we want is a targeted consumer boycott where we focus on key companies systematically. So once those companies have, come out and said, we're no longer going to support Israel, then we move on to the next company. And that's how we target a boycott, and we focus our efforts on those companies. And so here are some of the companies that they want to, that the BDS movement itself is asking to boycott. We talked about HP, we talked about Puma. AXA, I think you'll more likely be able to boycott something like this if you're kind of older and working on like insurance and things like that. Produce that comes from Israel, SodaStream, Sabra, Ahava, which requires, taking Dead Sea minerals from in the occupied Dead Sea area, and Pillsbury. So you see this list is a lot shorter than the ones here. I'm going to stop sharing, but a lot shorter than the list that you will find kind of floating around on Instagram where you like look at this really overwhelming page that is just logo, 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 and you're like, oh my God, that's like everything that I use in my life. That
True.
if you want to do that on an individual level, you have every right to do that. But what BDS calls for is a more targeted, systematic approach where we are focusing on key companies that right now, not indirectly, not just maybe through a CEO, they specifically are either pulling minerals or resources from within Palestine. They, for example, like it's not on the list, but Victoria's Secrets has warehouses in the West Bank. So people's homes were demolished in order to make room for this company's warehouses to be in the West Bank. These types of companies that are like currently directly on the ground in Palestine and profiting from our oppression, those are the ones that we want to focus on. And it's definitely been effective. And especially when we're not only pushing ourselves to do it, we're pushing our Muslim grocery stores and our Arab grocery stores to remove all these products from themselves, to say we're not selling Sabra hummus, we're not selling, Israeli produce and dates and focusing on that level. It's definitely effective. And it, in addition to, hitting them economically, it's also creating a narrative that puts us in the spotlight. So when we push for BDS on campus, it's often very symbolic because student government does not really have the ability to actually remove a university's investment in different Israeli companies. But what they do have the ability to do is start the conversation on campus. And from there, eventually it will make its way up to change makers. So that's what I would say on the topic of BDS, inshallah. And I know we're over time, so I don't want to take additional time, but if there's anything else y'all want to ask, just let me know.
Thank you so much. And I mean, we can just go on, and I'm sure so many have so many questions. It's so interesting, especially this point that you talked about, targeted boycott. That it makes so much sense because as people who are receiving these messages, whether it's on Instagram or Twitter, and you're getting these long lists, sometimes like pages long, and you're like, okay, where do I start and where do I end? And what happens at the end is you don't boycott anything because you just don't know what to do, right? So, but when you talk about targeted, it makes it more easy and it makes more sense doing it in that manner to see more results. One of our sixth graders has a question. Okay. So go ahead, Sophia.
So I was wondering what to do if you've already bought stuff from those companies, and you currently have them in your home. Should we get rid of them?
So if you've already bought them, the purchase has been made and the economic support has been made. And so I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting rid of them, but I would make sure that, let's say, for example, someone comes over and they like compliment your HP computer. You make sure to tell them, like, I'm never buying another HP computer. Like, yeah, I have one, but I'm never buying it again. Like, use it as a talking point. But I wouldn't recommend, because, our point is, inshallah, once we know, we implement it going forward. But we can't, go backwards. But that's a really good question. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair. Are there any more questions? We're going to take just one more because we're out of time, sadly. Inshallah, we'll have more of these. Is there anybody else who wants to ask anything else?
I think I saw maybe Sadia raise her hand.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
I just have a question regarding, like, do you have any book recommendations that we can, read to educate ourselves, like more like a more detailed history of like the occupation, anything?
Yes, I absolutely do. Let me get the exact names, but so one book that I recommend is Palestine, It Is Something Colonial. Let me see if I can drop links. This is written by Hatem Bazian. Let me drop this one here as a message to all. I'm putting it in the chat. So Palestine Is Something Colonial goes through the history. There's also a really good one by the creator of the Electronic Intifada, which is a really good source for knowledge on what's going on the ground. Ali Abu Ni'ma, Palestine. What's the name of that book? The Battle for Justice in Palestine. That's a good one too. And I would get it from Haymarket Books, just because I don't like buying from Amazon, evil company, but that's a different conversation. So that's 2 books that we can start with. And if I can come up with more, I'll send them, inshallah, to Sister Fawzia, but highly recommend those 2 books.
Thank you. Jazakumullahu khair, Noor. And, like Hadil mentioned about the curriculum in ISDs, I mean, we as Islamic schools have some blame to carry here, right? We have to, as Islamic schools, Palestine should be part of our curriculum. And sadly, it is not. I don't know why it is not, but inshallah, we're not going to look, whatever has happened, but going forward, inshallah, I think this change is so necessary. Like you said, education, right? And education for our middle schoolers, education for our high schoolers is so important. And where kids are coming to school and they're learning about Islam, they have to learn about Palestinian history. It should not be an if or a but, right? So inshallah, that's something that definitely we are going to be looking at as curriculum, and we will reach out to you for help.
Okay. Awesome. And I'll say for sure that both Mass Pace and the Palestinian Youth Movement are more than happy to put on more of these types of talks, and we can even go into like more details about BDS, more details about apartheid, more details about Al-Aqsa. We within an hour you can hardly talk about what's going on in the mosques and how the mosques are being specifically strategically taken over. Like,
Absolutely. We look forward to such a collaboration, inshallah. Aisha, go ahead as the social studies teacher.
Definitely. Thank you so much once again.
So I'll carry on with your curriculum for the day, inshallah.
She cut off. That's why she didn't hear.
I think she cut off. Yes,
yeah.
Sister Noor, I think you might be frozen, but Jazakallah khair on behalf of our girls and our staff here at QCA. You spoke so eloquently, so wonderfully, and there was so much detailed information about history. And I feel I always teach as a social studies teacher, my goal is to remind the girls that we have a civic duty, and that civic duty is to get educated and to get involved. And, it doesn't matter how old you are, the least we can do is to do our research and figure out a way to give back to people that, really need us at this point, inshallah. So I'm really looking forward to getting some more information about the Mass Pace so that way our girls can get involved, and maybe we and Qalam could do something and collaborate with you guys in the future as well.
Right.
That would be amazing.
We actually have a community service club at Qalam. Sister Sharifa leads that. So inshallah, definitely through our community service, we want our girls to be engaged. Number one, become educated, more educated and more aware of this cause before anything else.
Definitely.
So inshallah, once again, Noor, thank you very much for being here. Thank you for your time. And we look forward to seeing you again. And inshallah, may Allah bless you, and whatever you do, may Allah continue to bless you in your efforts. Jazakumullahu khair.
My pleasure. Assalamu alaikum.
Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
يا من أجبت دعاء نوح فانتصر وحملته في فلكك المشحون يا من أحال النار حول خليله روحا وريحانا بقول